Ambrose Kincaid had always been the steady heartbeat of Asheford, a small Midwestern town where time moved at a gentle, measured pace. Every morning, before the sun had fully risen above the sprawling cornfields, Ambrose would rise with a quiet dignity that set the tone for his day. He was a high school history teacher known not only for his encyclopedic knowledge of American heritage but also for his unwavering commitment to truth and fairness. His modest home, an old colonial structure wrapped in a tapestry of ivy and memories, spoke of simpler times when values mattered more than wealth. In every creaking floorboard and every weathered photograph on the mantel, there was evidence of a life lived with purpose. Ambrose's days began in the soft pre-dawn light, as he prepared breakfast in a kitchen that smelled faintly of fresh bread and coffee. At the small wooden table in the sunroom, he would sit with his daughter, Araminta, known to everyone simply as Mint. Mint was a bright-eyed, resilient young woman with hazel eyes that mirrored both curiosity and determination. Even as a child, she had been captivated by her father's stories of heroes, revolutions, and the enduring spirit of the common man. Their morning ritual was sacrosanct, a shared moment of reflection and warmth before the outside world could intrude. Over breakfast, Ambrose would recount tales of historical figures who had fought against injustice, while Mint listened intently, absorbing every word as if it were a secret lesson in hope. The town of Asheford itself was a patchwork of close-knit families, time-worn storefronts, and community gatherings where everyone greeted one another by name. Neighbors would exchange friendly nods and offer assistance without hesitation. Ambrose was at the center of this communal life, an emblem of honesty in a world that sometimes seemed to favor the opposite. His gentle demeanor and unyielding moral compass had earned him the respect of local officials and the adoration of parents who hoped their children might one day emulate his kindness. Yet beneath the veneer of pastoral tranquility, there were whispers, small, unspoken worries that not everyone was as they appeared. On one particularly crisp autumn morning, as amber leaves swirled in the cool breeze outside the window, Ambrose prepared for his day with his usual calm. He checked his worn briefcase for lesson plans and important documents, his mind already wandering to the upcoming history class where he planned to discuss the struggle for civil rights, a subject that resonated deeply with him. Mint, now a young woman whose gentle smile belied a fiery inner strength, packed her school bag with quiet purpose. Though she was still in high school, her eyes held the weight of someone far beyond her years. She had learned early that life was as fragile as it was precious. As the town slowly awakened, Ambrose walked down the familiar streets lined with weathered brick buildings and well-tended gardens. Children bicycled along the sidewalks while elderly neighbors greeted each other on stoops. There was a sense of unspoken security in Asheford, a belief that everyone would look out for one another. But as Ambrose strolled past the local diner and the town's modest library, a subtle tension hung in the air, as if fate were silently weaving a tapestry of events that would forever alter the course of his life. Unbeknownst to him, dark forces were already stirring beyond the horizon. Rumors had begun to circulate in hushed tones about a growing network of corruption infiltrating local institutions, led by those who wielded power without accountability. Ambrose had no inkling of this shadow creeping ever closer to his doorstep, or that his steadfast integrity would soon place him at the center of a storm he could never have imagined. That morning, as Ambrose prepared to head to school, he paused at the door of his ivy-clad home, taking one last moment to absorb the beauty of the early light. His mind wandered to memories of his own father, a man of deep principles who had sacrificed much to instill in him the values of honesty and perseverance. The weight of history, both personal and collective, seemed to settle on his shoulders as he stepped outside, unaware that the very qualities that defined him would soon become the target of a sinister plot. In that quiet hour before chaos, Ambrose's life was a testament to simple truths, a dedication to education, an unbreakable bond with his daughter, and an abiding belief that goodness could prevail. The serene cadence of his daily routine was a fragile cocoon, shielding him from a world that was on the verge of betrayal and upheaval. As the sun rose higher over Asheford, its rays illuminating the worn sidewalks and hopeful faces, no one could have predicted the tragedy that would soon shatter this fragile peace. Yet in that brief, perfect moment of normalcy, Ambrose Kincaid and his beloved daughter Mint embraced life with the steadfast courage that would soon be called upon in ways they could scarcely imagine. On a seemingly ordinary autumn morning, as the town of Asheford slowly stirred to life, the tranquility that had once enveloped Ambrose Kincaid's life was brutally shattered. In the soft light of dawn, Ambrose stepped out of his ivy-draped home with the same quiet dignity he had carried for years, completely unaware that dark forces were gathering to upend the very fabric of his existence. His routine had always been predictable: a gentle stroll down familiar sidewalks, a brief wave to neighbors, and the comforting promise of another day spent imparting wisdom to his students. But that day, the unsuspecting serenity was replaced by an undercurrent of dread that would soon engulf him. As Ambrose walked along the tree-lined street, the crisp air carried whispers of unease that he could neither see nor quite comprehend. At first, it was nothing more than a fleeting sensation, a chill creeping along his spine. Yet, as he approached the local post office, a stark contrast to the usual calm, a convoy of unmarked vehicles rumbled up the road. In the distance, the shrill sound of sirens began to pierce the morning quiet. By the time he reached the intersection, a small crowd of neighbors had gathered, their faces etched with confusion and alarm. Without warning, uniformed officers surrounded him. One man, his expression hard and devoid of the empathy that had always characterized Ashford's protectors, barked orders. Ambrose, ever composed despite the sudden intrusion, raised his hands slowly, trying to understand the unfolding scene. The officers, moving with cold efficiency, quickly cuffed him. As he was led away, Ambrose's eyes, normally warm and gentle, betrayed only a deep, quiet sorrow. He glanced back at his home, a place filled with cherished memories of laughter, learning, and the enduring love he had nurtured with his daughter, Mint, yet he could offer no explanation, for he was as innocent as the morning light. Mint, who had been sharing breakfast with him on the back porch just moments earlier, witnessed the scene in paralyzing disbelief. From her vantage point on the porch, she saw her father's steadfast gaze falter just enough for a flicker of confusion to cross his features, as if silently pleading for some understanding that no one could offer. Neighbors murmured in shock, some tried to call out for justice, but their voices were swallowed by the heavy silence that fell over the street. The police, it later emerged, had been manipulated by the sinister machinations of Calloway Drayton, a local official with a hidden agenda and a reputation for orchestrating deceptions that left no room for truth. Drayton had colluded with shadowy figures to plant damning evidence against Ambrose, carefully crafting a narrative that painted the gentle teacher as a cold-blooded criminal. Rumors swirled among the townsfolk like the swirling autumn leaves, whispers of secret meetings, hushed conversations in darkened rooms, and a network of corruption that reached into the very heart of Ashford's institutions. Inside the police cruiser, as Ambrose was driven away from his beloved town, he sat in stoic silence. His mind, a repository of all the lessons of history he had taught over decades, now turned inward. He recalled the ideals of justice and the enduring strength of truth, and although a sense of overwhelming betrayal weighed upon him, he clung to the hope that one day the scales would be balanced. Outside the window, the once familiar streets of Ashford blurred into a landscape of uncertainty. A town that had trusted him implicitly now seemed complicit in a conspiracy he could not fathom. Back in the quiet interior of their home, Mint's world splintered into a mosaic of confusion, grief, and fierce determination. The shock of seeing her father, the embodiment of goodness and decency, forcibly removed from his life, was too much to bear. Mint, whose name had always evoked a gentle resilience, felt a raging fire ignite within her. The whispers among neighbors, the furtive glances, and the sudden arrival of stern-faced officers confirmed that her father's arrest was not the result of some inexplicable misfortune but a calculated act of treachery. As news of the arrest spread through Ashford like wildfire, the community found itself divided between disbelief and resignation. Some people, unwilling to confront the possibility that their most trusted citizen had been framed, clung to the comforting illusion that justice would prevail. Others, more attuned to the undercurrents of corruption that had long festered beneath the town's idyllic surface, looked on with heavy hearts, already mourning the loss of a man whose reputation was built on unassailable integrity. In the days that followed, as Ambrose's trial loomed on the horizon, the true depth of the conspiracy began to emerge. Evidence that had been manipulated, testimonies that had been coerced, and the sinister fingerprints of Calloway Drayton all converged to construct an almost unbreakable case against the innocent teacher. Mint, now burdened with the crushing weight of grief and a newfound resolve, silently vowed to uncover the truth behind the charges, to fight against the injustice that had torn her family apart, and to restore her father's honor no matter the cost. Ambrose's arrest was not merely an isolated act of malice, it was the spark that ignited a flame of resistance in the heart of Asheford, a call to action that would soon echo far beyond the borders of the small town. And in that fateful morning, as the first rays of sunlight bathed the deserted street in a deceptive glow, the seeds of rebellion were sown in the fertile soil of despair, promising that the battle for truth and redemption was only just beginning. In the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with tension and disbelief, as if every person present sensed that what they were witnessing was a gross miscarriage of justice. Ambrose Kincaid sat at the defendant's table with a quiet dignity that belied the turmoil raging inside him. His lined face, usually so calm and reassuring, now carried an expression of profound sorrow and stoic resignation. Across the room, the prosecution's table was filled with slick attorneys and government officials whose eyes betrayed nothing but cold calculation. The judge, a stern man with years of experience etched into every wrinkle, presided over the trial with an air of finality that seemed to preclude any hope of mercy. The proceedings began with a barrage of damning evidence that had been meticulously, if deceitfully, assembled by the conspirators. Photographs, altered documents, and fabricated witness testimonies were presented one after the other, each piece intended to paint Ambrose as a cunning criminal rather than the gentle, principled man he truly was. The prosecuting attorney, his voice measured and persuasive, recounted a narrative that was as compelling as it was false. He spoke of secret meetings, supposed transactions, and dubious associations with notorious figures, none of which had any grounding in reality but were designed to overwhelm the jury with a tide of insinuation and falsehood. Mint sat in the gallery, her heart pounding in her ears as she watched her father's fate being sealed by the very system that was meant to protect the innocent. Every time a piece of fabricated evidence was introduced, her stomach twisted in anguish. Yet amid the sorrow, a fierce determination began to burn within her. She clutched a small, worn notebook tightly to her chest, a silent promise that she would not let this injustice stand unchallenged. During the trial, Ambrose maintained a quiet composure, speaking only when directly questioned. His responses, though few, were measured and heartfelt, a stark contrast to the theatrics on the other side of the courtroom. When the defense attorney, Hollis Abernathy, a man known for his stubborn integrity despite the overwhelming odds, attempted to cast doubt on the prosecution's case, his words were drowned out by the meticulous presentation of evidence that had clearly been tampered with. The judge, bound by the pressures of political influence and the unyielding power of those behind the scenes, allowed the proceedings to continue without any indication of reconsideration or a thorough re-examination of the facts. Witness after witness took the stand, each testimony more contrived than the last. Some witnesses, their eyes red from sleepless nights, recited memorized lines that had been coached by those who wanted to see Ambrose fall. Others, overcome by the fear of reprisal, offered only vague accounts that did nothing to bolster the prosecution's fabricated narrative. In the midst of this orchestrated spectacle, a few members of the community, neighbors who had known Ambrose for decades, whispered their doubts to one another in hushed tones, their expressions a mixture of sorrow and outrage. Yet the trial machinery, relentless and unyielding, moved forward as if propelled by an unseen force determined to silence the truth. Throughout the day, the tension in the courtroom became almost unbearable. The air was heavy with the combined weight of lives shattered by the relentless march of corruption. Ambrose's eyes, which had once shone with the light of knowledge and compassion, now flickered with a quiet, desperate hope that someone, somewhere, would stand up against this travesty. When Hollis Abernathy made a brief, impassioned plea for a fair hearing, a plea that touched the hearts of a few jurors, the moment was swiftly overshadowed by the prosecutorial barrage. The judge's gavel finally fell with a resounding finality that echoed through the room, sealing Ambrose's fate as the death penalty was pronounced. In that moment, time seemed to stand still, and the entire courtroom was engulfed in a profound, crushing silence. After the verdict, as the murmurs of shock and disbelief filled the corridors of the courthouse, Mint remained frozen in the gallery. Her eyes glistened with tears that mirrored both grief and a burning, quiet resolve. The injustice of the sentence was not lost on her, and as she left the courthouse that day, the bitter taste of despair mingled with a fierce determination to uncover the truth behind the elaborate frame-up. Every step she took was laden with the weight of a promise, to her father, to herself, and to the community of Asheford that had been betrayed by its own protectors. In the weeks that followed, while Ambrose was confined to a stark, isolating cell on death row, Mint began to gather secret documents, recorded whispered confessions from those who still believed in justice, and built a clandestine network of supporters determined to challenge the corruption that had condemned her father. The trial, though seemingly the end of Ambrose's journey, had become the catalyst for a far greater struggle, a fight for truth that would soon shake the very foundations of the corrupt system that had turned an innocent man into a scapegoat. And in that painful, sorrowful silence that followed the gavel's final strike, the seeds of rebellion and hope were quietly sown, promising that the darkness of injustice would not be allowed to reign forever. Locked away on death row, Ambrose Kincaid faced the endless passage of time in a small, sterile cell that seemed determined to drain every ounce of hope from his soul. The harsh fluorescent light overhead flickered intermittently, casting long, wavering shadows on the cold, cement walls, a constant reminder that every day was a struggle against the inevitable. Isolated from the outside world, Ambrose clung to memories of warm summer mornings on the back porch of his ivy-covered home, of quiet conversations with his daughter Mint, and of the stories he had so lovingly shared with his students. These recollections, though bittersweet, were his only solace as he wrestled with the profound injustice that had led to his condemnation. In the deep silence of his cell, he often found himself murmuring lines from the great speeches of history, words of resilience and defiance that had once inspired him in the classroom, and now served as a fragile lifeline to his battered spirit. Each day on death row was marked by an unyielding routine that left little room for hope, yet Ambrose refused to surrender entirely to despair. He spent hours reflecting on his life, reviewing the choices he had made and the values he had lived by. Despite the physical confinement and the oppressive atmosphere of institutional punishment, his inner world remained a vast reservoir of memories, dreams, and unwavering principles. In those solitary moments, he recalled the gentle touch of Mint's hand, the encouraging smile on her face when they shared breakfast, and the unspoken bond that had sustained him through life's many hardships. Even as the weight of his wrongful fate pressed upon him, Ambrose nurtured a quiet faith that truth and justice, though delayed, would eventually prevail. His mind became both a sanctuary and a battleground, where hope waged a silent war against the encroaching darkness of injustice. Meanwhile, miles away from the oppressive confines of the prison, Mint's life took on a new urgency. The verdict had shattered her world, and the image of her father's steady, kind eyes haunted her every waking moment. Determined not to allow the cruelty of the system to extinguish the light in her father's soul, Mint retreated to the solitude of her small apartment above the local diner. In that cramped, modest space filled with the aroma of brewing coffee and the soft murmur of a television in the background, she began to transform her grief into a meticulous plan for redemption. Every sleepless night became a battleground where she pored over legal documents, scrutinized old case files, and meticulously compiled testimonies from those who still believed in her father's innocence. Her journal, filled with hastily scribbled notes and fragments of overheard conversations, was no longer a mere record of her pain, it was rapidly evolving into a blueprint for justice. As days turned into nights and back into days again, Mint's determination grew stronger. The injustice inflicted upon Ambrose had awakened something fierce within her, a resolve to infiltrate the labyrinthine corridors of corruption that had orchestrated his downfall. She spent long hours at the local library, a quiet sanctuary where she devoured volumes on legal theory, forensic analysis, and even the strategies of historical reformers. With each piece of research, she discovered new inconsistencies in the prosecution's case, a missing document here, a contradictory witness statement there, that painted an increasingly damning portrait of the forces that had framed her father. Mint's resolve was tempered by caution, for she knew that the enemy she sought to expose was powerful and cunning. Yet, every night, as she looked out over the darkened streets of Asheford from her window, the glimmer of hope in her eyes shone a little brighter, fueled by the belief that her relentless quest for truth might one day bring her father home. In the silent interplay between Ambrose's reflective solitude on death row and Mint's relentless pursuit of justice, an unspoken promise was forged, a promise that the corrupt forces that had condemned an innocent man would one day be unmasked. As Ambrose clung to the fragments of his cherished memories, and Mint meticulously constructed the roadmap to redemption, both father and daughter nurtured the belief that even in the most desolate of circumstances, the light of truth could never be fully extinguished. Their separate battles, though worlds apart, were united by a single, unwavering conviction, that justice, no matter how delayed or obscured, would eventually triumph over the darkness. Mint's quest for justice accelerated into a full-blown mission as she began to traverse the undercurrents of Ashford's clandestine world. Under cover of darkness, she assumed a new identity, a determined, resourceful investigator whose presence was as inconspicuous as it was resolute. Every day, she frequented forgotten corners of town, dusty archives in the local library, back rooms of long-forgotten businesses, and even the dimly lit halls of community centers where hushed whispers of corruption had once been dismissed as mere rumors. There, amidst yellowed files and whispered confessions, she unearthed evidence that challenged the official narrative of her father's trial. Mint meticulously compiled a dossier, bank statements that bore traces of illicit transfers, transcripts of overheard conversations that hinted at bribes, and secret letters that, when pieced together, revealed a web of deceit orchestrated by the powerful Callaway Drayton and his network of enablers. In her quest, Mint formed unlikely alliances with individuals who had also suffered under the weight of corruption. Jovian Travers, an intrepid investigative journalist known for his piercing exposés of local scandals, became her closest confidant. Their first meeting was arranged in a nondescript café at the edge of town. Over bitter coffee and in the shadow of peeling wallpaper, Jovian listened intently as Mint recounted the inconsistencies in the case against her father. His eyes, sharp and inquisitive, sparked with a mix of empathy and professional fervor. He revealed that he had been tracking similar irregularities for months, a trail that led him to suspect that high-ranking officials had conspired to fabricate evidence and manipulate witness testimonies. Together, they began cross-referencing public records, scrutinizing court transcripts, and even interviewing former law enforcement officers who had long since resigned under mysterious circumstances. Sutton Ellsworth, a disillusioned ex-cop with a haunted past and a keen sense of justice, soon joined their covert operation. Sutton's insider knowledge of the police force's inner workings and his intimate understanding of the town's power structures became invaluable. Late one rainy evening, under the flicker of a single street lamp, Sutton met with Mint in a secluded alley behind an abandoned warehouse. There, he shared his first-hand accounts of suspicious meetings and secret exchanges that he had witnessed before his departure from the force. His narrative painted a damning picture of Deputy McLean's involvement and hinted at a broader network that had compromised not just one man but the integrity of the entire local law enforcement apparatus. Armed with this new information, Mint began to plan a series of discreet, dangerous meetings. Each encounter was meticulously arranged, often in the dead of night or in the quiet aftermath of a town meeting, to avoid drawing unwanted attention. She met with a retired district attorney who had once been forced to silence his pursuit of the truth, and he, in turn, provided her with old case files that corroborated her suspicions. Every scrap of evidence, from surveillance footage captured by a sympathetic neighbor to whispered confessions recorded on a digital voice recorder, was added to the growing body of proof that pointed directly to the corruption masterminded by Callaway Drayton. As the months passed, Mint's investigation grew bolder. She began to leverage her alliances, using the collective weight of their discoveries to pressure key figures in the community to speak out. Secret meetings in dimly lit basements turned into a network of informants, local business owners, minor officials, and even a few members of the police force, who were willing to risk their safety for the chance to see justice prevail. Despite constant threats, including ominous notes left on her doorstep and the unnerving presence of shadowy figures following her on rainy nights, Mint pressed on. Each act of intimidation only served to reinforce her resolve. She documented every incident with meticulous care, ensuring that nothing would be lost to the darkness of fear. One particularly harrowing night, while returning from a meeting with an anonymous whistleblower, Mint was forced to navigate a labyrinth of deserted streets. In the hush of the midnight hour, as she quickened her pace with her recorder clutched tightly in her hand, she sensed a presence behind her. The sound of footsteps echoing in the narrow alley sent a shiver down her spine. In that tense moment, she ducked into a shuttered storefront, her heart pounding like a war drum. Hidden in the shadows, she listened as muffled voices argued about silencing a persistent intruder. Though she remained unseen, the encounter left her shaken. The conspirators were not only willing to frame her father but would also go to extreme lengths to silence anyone daring to uncover the truth. Undeterred by the danger, Mint redoubled her efforts. Every piece of evidence she collected was cross-verified and carefully archived, building an indisputable case against those who had manipulated the system. Her actions began to have a tangible impact. In whispered conversations at local diners and town halls, people started to speak of the possibility that the case against Ambrose was built on lies. The tide of public opinion, once resigned to the idea that an innocent man could be condemned, started to shift. Community leaders who had once been silent in the face of corruption began to question the integrity of the local justice system. By the end of this arduous chapter, Mint's dossier had grown into a formidable arsenal of evidence. In secret gatherings with Jovian and Sutton, she reviewed every detail, each document, each recorded conversation, knowing that the moment for exposing the truth was drawing near. Her determination was unyielding, and the pain of her father's wrongful conviction had been transformed into a burning desire for retribution and redemption. As she carefully organized her findings in a secure location, the light of dawn began to break over Asheford, promising that the culmination of her relentless pursuit would soon bring the long-overdue reckoning for those who had wronged her family. And in that fragile promise of a new day, Mint's journey from a grieving daughter to a fierce crusader for justice had truly taken shape. In the weeks following her harrowing encounter in the deserted alleys of Asheford, Mint's investigation entered a dangerous new phase. The relentless pursuit of evidence had forced her deeper into the labyrinth of corruption that had conspired to condemn her father. Every night, the town's quiet streets transformed into a clandestine arena where whispered secrets were traded like currency. Mint's every step was shadowed by the risk of discovery, and the constant fear of being followed gnawed at her resolve. Yet, driven by a burning need for justice, she pressed on, determined to expose the network that had manipulated the scales of truth. Under the cover of darkness, Mint began meeting with a new cadre of informants who had once lived in the margins of Ashford society. In a dilapidated community center that had long been abandoned by the mainstream, she encountered a group of former city employees, small business owners, and even a few disillusioned police officers who spoke in hushed, urgent tones about the deep-seated influence of Calloway Drayton. One such meeting took place in a narrow, smoke-filled back room, where a nervous clerk named Frank Winslow recounted how he'd witnessed a series of clandestine transactions, envelopes exchanged in dim parking lots and bank deposits made in unmarked accounts, that tied local officials directly to a network of organized crime. His trembling voice and darting eyes betrayed a man who had seen too much and feared the consequences of speaking out. As Mint compiled these accounts, her notebook overflowed with details, the names of shadowy figures, the dates of secret meetings, and even obscure phone numbers that hinted at encrypted communications. Each piece of information, though scattered and at times contradictory, began to form a pattern that linked seemingly disparate incidents into a coherent narrative of systemic betrayal. She spent countless nights poring over public records in the dusty stacks of the Ashford Library, cross-referencing witness statements with old court documents and financial ledgers that were overlooked by those who preferred silence to truth. One particularly cold evening, as rain slicked the deserted streets and turned them into reflective puddles, Mint found herself tailing a dark sedan that had repeatedly circled the rusted trail diner. With her heart pounding in her ears, she followed the vehicle at a cautious distance, her pulse quickening with each red light and every narrow alley she passed. The sedan eventually pulled up in front of an old warehouse on the outskirts of town, a building that, by day, appeared abandoned but at night became the stage for secret exchanges. Hidden behind a stack of discarded crates, Mint waited until a single, burly man emerged from the warehouse. Through the mist, she could see a glint of a badge and a distinctive tattoo on his forearm, details that matched one of the names she had noted earlier. With a shaky hand, she recorded the scene on her digital recorder, every moment etching itself into her memory as undeniable evidence of the conspiracy. Back at her small apartment above the local diner, Mint's determination was tempered only by the mounting danger. Threatening notes began to appear on her door, scrawled in jagged handwriting that warned her to stop digging if she valued her family's safety. Even the once friendly faces in the town started to look suspicious. Neighbors who had once offered warm smiles now avoided her gaze, as if afraid to be associated with her crusade for truth. Yet, despite the isolation and the palpable threat, Mint found an inner strength that grew with every piece of evidence she gathered. The more she uncovered, the more she realized that the web of corruption was vast and interwoven into every fabric of Ashford society. It was a revelation that both terrified and galvanized her. In a pivotal moment that would define the next phase of her struggle, Mint arranged a secret meeting with a former prosecutor who had been forced to resign after trying to expose similar scandals years before. In a cramped, poorly lit diner on the edge of town, the ex-prosecutor, whose eyes carried the weariness of one who had battled giants, shared with her a cache of documents that detailed instances of bribery and cover-ups dating back nearly a decade. These records, once meticulously hidden away, now shone a stark light on the systematic abuse of power that had ensnared her father. As she flipped through the brittle pages, Mint realized that the evidence was not only sufficient to clear Ambrose's name but also to dismantle the corrupt network that had allowed such a miscarriage of justice to occur. That night, as the wind howled outside and the rain hammered the windows, Mint sat alone at her rickety kitchen table, the documents spread out before her like the bones of a long-dead secret. The room was filled with the scent of old paper and determination, and as she carefully organized her findings, she made a silent vow to herself and to her father: no matter how many obstacles lay in her path, she would see this fight through to the end. Every stolen moment, every risk taken, was a step toward exposing the truth that had been so callously buried by those in power. In the dim glow of her solitary lamp, with the echoes of distant sirens and the relentless patter of rain as her only companions, Mint felt the full weight of her mission. The danger was imminent, the opposition formidable, but the light of truth, however faint, began to break through the suffocating darkness. And as she pressed her pen to paper to write down the final details of that long, arduous day, she knew that the seeds of revolution were being sown in her relentless pursuit of justice, seeds that, with time, would blossom into a movement strong enough to reclaim the honor of her father and restore hope to the people of Ashford. Under a tumultuous, stormy night that seemed to mirror the inner turmoil of Ashford, Mint received a tip that would change the course of her quest. An encrypted message had led her to a forgotten parking garage on the outskirts of town, a skeletal structure lit only by the erratic glow of a single, flickering overhead bulb and the intermittent flashes of lightning in the distance. With her heart pounding in her ears and her recorder clutched tightly in hand, she arrived at the meeting point, every instinct alert to the danger lurking in the shadows. A figure emerged from the darkness, a man whose presence was both hesitant and desperate. He introduced himself as Ambrose Ace Langford, a former aide to Calloway Drayton, whose voice trembled with years of suppressed guilt and regret. His eyes, haunted yet resolute, conveyed that he had been complicit in the conspiracy until his own conscience forced him to break ranks. In the echoing emptiness of the garage, Ace explained in low, urgent tones how he had witnessed secret meetings and the covert exchange of envelopes laden with incriminating evidence. He pulled out a small flash drive, its surface scratched and worn, and pressed it into Mint's hand. Ace recounted that the drive contained detailed records, encrypted spreadsheets of illicit bank transfers, meticulously altered forensic reports, and countless covert emails that documented a sinister pattern of bribery and cover-ups orchestrated by Drayton and his allies. His words painted a vivid picture of systemic corruption, a network that had not only framed her father but had corrupted the very pillars of Ashford's local government. As thunder rumbled overhead, Ace's confession was punctuated by a palpable mix of fear and hope, a hope that by releasing this evidence, the truth could finally see the light of day. Mint listened intently, her eyes never leaving his, as she absorbed every detail. The gravity of his revelations was overwhelming, yet she felt a surge of determination rising within her. She reassured Ace with a trembling promise that his bravery in coming forward would not be in vain, and that together they would expose the web of deceit. Every moment in that dank, rain-soaked space seemed to stretch into an eternity, with the rhythmic sound of raindrops against the concrete walls marking the passage of time as fate hung in the balance. With the flash drive secured and Ace's testimony recorded on her digital voice recorder, Mint left the garage, her mind racing with plans for what to do next. She immediately contacted Jovian Travers and Sutton Ellsworth, her closest allies in this crusade. In a flurry of secret texts and hushed phone calls, they convened in a safe house, a nondescript, fortified building that served as the nerve center for their operation. There, by the dim light of a single lamp, the trio pored over the contents of the flash drive. Every file was scrutinized with painstaking care, the numbers, dates, and names slowly began to form a damning mosaic of corruption that reached deep into the corridors of power. Jovian's eyes widened as he recognized the pattern. Key figures in the town's administration, including Calloway Drayton, were implicated in financial transactions that defied explanation. Sutton, drawing on his insider knowledge from his days on the police force, identified coded phrases that had been used to mask illegal deals and hush payments. The trio spent hours debating strategy, aware that this evidence was not only a lifeline for Ambrose's case but also the catalyst needed to dismantle the corrupt network once and for all. As dawn approached, Mint felt the full weight of what lay ahead. They decided it was time for a daring, public exposé, a moment that would shatter the carefully constructed facade of authority in Ashford. Working quickly and discreetly, Jovian prepared a comprehensive investigative report, complete with video clips, audio recordings, and scanned copies of the incriminating documents. Sutton provided eyewitness testimonies, and Mint wove together her own narrative, the heartbreaking story of a devoted teacher unjustly condemned, and a daughter's relentless battle against a rigged system. That morning, the exposé aired on national television. The story unfolded with a shocking clarity. Images of the flash drive's contents flashed across screens, live interviews with community members filled the air with raw emotion, and, most powerfully, Mint's own voice, steady, determined, and filled with the pain of personal loss, spoke of the injustice that had befallen her father. The broadcast, unflinching and unsparing, struck a chord far beyond the borders of Ashford. Within hours, social media erupted with outrage, and news outlets across the country picked up the story, demanding accountability and reform. In the wake of the exposé, pressure mounted like a tidal wave. State authorities, now confronted with the irrefutable evidence and public outcry, reopened Ambrose's case. Calls for an independent investigation into Calloway Drayton and his cohorts grew louder, and even those who had once been silent began to speak out. The dark veil of corruption that had long shrouded Ashford was lifted, and for the first time in years, the people felt that justice was within reach. For Mint, that tempestuous night in the parking garage had marked a turning point, a moment when the unthinkable became a catalyst for change. The risk had been monumental, the threat of retaliation real and immediate, yet her determination had ignited a movement that promised to restore not only her father's honor but the integrity of an entire community. And as the first rays of a new day broke over Ashford, Mint stood among her allies, her heart both heavy with loss and buoyant with hope, knowing that even the darkest secrets, when brought to light, could pave the way for redemption. As the autumn leaves finally gave way to the soft promise of winter, Ashford itself began to feel the tremors of long overdue change. In a public ceremony held in the town square, once a place of hushed whispers and guarded glances, Ambrose Kincaid was finally exonerated. The state, under mounting pressure from national outcry and relentless investigations, had reopened his case. Overwhelming evidence gathered by Mint and her steadfast allies had shattered the elaborate facade of corruption that had condemned him. On that crisp morning, as the first pale rays of sunlight filtered through the clouds, Ambrose stepped out of the courthouse as a free man. His gait, though still measured and deliberate, carried the quiet triumph of a man who had weathered an impossible storm. The town square teemed with people, neighbors, former skeptics, and newly emboldened voices of the community all gathered to witness a moment that seemed almost miraculous. Banners fluttered and tearful smiles mingled with expressions of resolute joy as Ambrose's name was read aloud, accompanied by proclamations of justice restored. Amid the crowd, Mint stood with a posture that belied the hardships she had endured, a figure of both strength and tenderness. When the moment came for Ambrose to speak, he paused to look at her. Their eyes met, and in that silent exchange lay a lifetime of unspoken understanding, the heartache, the solitary nights spent poring over case files, the perilous journeys through dark alleys, all of it had led to this redemptive reunion. Later that day, as Ambrose returned to his ivy-clad home, a home that had once felt like a distant memory, the town's atmosphere had transformed. The air was filled with the hum of hopeful conversations, and even the old corners of Asheford seemed to glow with a renewed sense of purpose. The corrupt officials had either resigned or been taken into custody, and sweeping reforms were already being discussed in community meetings. Ambrose's wrongful conviction had become a catalyst for systemic change, a stark reminder that even the most entrenched corruption could be overcome when truth was allowed to shine. In the weeks that followed, Mint found herself at the center of a burgeoning movement. Invitations to speak at town halls, local schools, and community gatherings poured in. With a voice that had once been choked by grief, she now spoke passionately about justice, the importance of accountability, and the resilience of the human spirit. Every testimony she gave and every story she shared helped to heal the deep wounds of a community long divided by fear and mistrust. Her relentless pursuit of truth had not only cleared her father's name but had also inspired others to stand up and demand transparency from those in power. Ambrose, though forever marked by his ordeal, embraced his new life with quiet dignity. He resumed teaching at the local high school, where his return was met with applause and heartfelt embraces from students and colleagues alike. His classes, once quiet and contemplative, now buzzed with discussions about civic duty, moral courage, and the true meaning of justice. Each lesson became a living testament to the fact that no matter how dark the path, the light of truth and integrity could guide even the most lost soul home. On a serene winter evening, as soft snow began to settle over the streets of Asheford, father and daughter sat together on the front porch of their home. The cold air was crisp, and the sound of distant laughter and the murmur of a recovering community filled the silence between them. Ambrose wrapped a gentle arm around Mint, and she rested her head on his shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of the extraordinary journey they had shared. They spoke little, for in that quiet moment, the hardships of the past were eclipsed by the comforting promise of a better future. In the hearts of all who had witnessed the transformation, a seed of hope had been planted, an enduring belief that even in the face of overwhelming injustice, perseverance, and the courage to speak out could set the world on a path toward redemption. Ambrose and Mint had become symbols of resilience, their story a beacon to those who had suffered in silence. As the snow continued to fall, blanketing Asheford in a peaceful, white embrace, it was clear that the scars of the past, though indelible, had given way to a profound strength. In that tranquil, hopeful winter night, the community of Asheford found solace in knowing that justice, however delayed, could indeed prevail, and that every shattered life held within it the potential to rebuild a future defined by integrity, compassion, and unyielding hope.